presentation first, and then I will take the white card that we have.
I wish I got to do presentations like the last one. So this is an action item to present information and then recommend the governing board call for the sale of the remaining $22 million in bonds that were authorized by district voters in November of 2009. I have in support tonight Megan Wienand of RBC and Sarah Smith of Gus Rosenfeld, in case y'all have questions of a more technical nature. We thank them for being here. We'll look at sort of the rules about bonded indebtedness, how they pertain to Creighton School District. The long-range facilities plan, I reviewed that with you in April, so I have it here again tonight, but it's more condensed into just a couple of slides. A very brief history of where we're at with the bond program right now and a possible next step. So the statute that regulates bonded indebtedness of Arizona school districts, this is what it says right now, and our limit is 5% of the taxable property used for the secondary property tax purposes. That's why we presented earlier in the year options centered around possibly issuing $7 million in bonds, because that's what our capacity would be in July under the current legislation. That bill was signed yesterday that raised that to 10% of taxable property for secondary property tax purposes. And 10% was the traditional rate sort of back in the day until the state created the Schools Facilities Board, which in theory was going to provide new construction and building renewals money to keep the buildings up to state standard and build you a new school. In fact, anytime your square footage per student in the district fell below a certain level. Excellency School is one of those, but that's really not going on anymore. But if it were, the theory is districts wouldn't need to issue bonds anymore, because all the stuff that you would issue bonds for was taken care of by the state. But since it's not funded, more districts are now going for bonds, and Creighton was one of those. So the current legislation has changed to 10% of those values, and so here's what that would have looked like, and in fact what it does look like. So in July 1st, we always make a principal payment. That's $3,850,000 there in the third line. The secondary assessed valuation is the top line. So on July 2nd, we would have the old year valuation still in effect at $372 million. In August, then the new valuations become official and become part of that formula, and ours has decreased 10% this year, and so that would lower the district's debt ceiling, so to speak. So right after July, we would have had $7 million. That's in capacity, and that's why options were presented along those lines. As it is now, there's a 90-day rule for the new legislation to come into being, and that would be mid-September. And so at that point, we would have enough capacity to issue the remainder of our bonds. So you see that if you calc that out, it becomes very close to, in fact, immaterially close to, but not quite to $22 million. And it is possible for us to deposit that small amount of money into escrow, so to speak, and so that also frees up debt, and so that's probably what we would do to get to 22 million. So it's coincidental that it came out that close with the new legislation, just coincidentally to the amount of authorization we had remaining. So any questions about that calculation? This is our amortization schedule for this first authority. So the first column are the dates that we make payments. We make payments twice a year. In January, we make an interest payment, and on July 1st of each year, we pay another 6 months interest, and we also make a principal payment. So that next column that says principal at the top, the crossed out ones are payments that we have made. That $3,850,000 we will pay on July 1st, so that revenue has been collected throughout the year, and in July we'll have enough to make that payment. And you can see future payments on down the line until you come to a payment in 2015, and then there's not another one until 2021. Those in 2021 and 22 are the Build America bonds that we entered into. That was part of the stimulus package, and so those bonds were not tax exempt, so they had a higher yield to attract different investors, and then the federal government reimburses us the difference to account for that higher tax rate that the district would not otherwise have had to pay. So we did participate in that program. And then those intervening years in between where it says new issue, that's where any new bonds would go, the principal payments for any new bonds that we would issue. So that's not coincidence, that's how that was sort of planned out all along. The tax impact, then you can see from this chart, is that in 2015 we make a payment, and that year we pay $4,004,610. So you can see that in the annual debt service column, the one to the far right. And then it drops to issue payment, interest payment. So the year after that it's $264,000. So that's interest. So if we issued additional bonds, that interest would incrementally ratchet up because we would have a higher balance outstanding. But other than that, the tax rate, instead of dropping to only cover that $264,000, would have a principal payment there, and so the tax rate would basically remain steady.
So Mr. Walmer, that right column that says annual debt service, or I'm supposed to say service, is our secondary, that would be charged to our secondary valuations, assessment basically to the
Yes.
to the property tax. Okay, thank you.
Bond payments and overrides are applied to the secondary levy.
So what we have been, our annual debt service payment has, it seems like it goes up and it goes down in the last few years under the current bond, but it seems to have been relatively stable at around the $4 million mark the last few years, just an observance. Okay.
So while we're talking about tax rates, I would add that if we authorize these bonds and we sell them and we substantially address a new school, there would be adjacent ways expenditures as well. If you recall, when we built Papago, we levied $1 million over 2 years for adjacent ways, and that impacts, well, that's the primary levy, but that impacts the tax rate as well. Adjacent ways are monies that a board can levy for things to connect the school with the outside world, so bus bays, sidewalks, utilities that have to be moved, all of that kind of stuff, and then a lot of that goes into a new school as well. So the long-range facilities plan, again, we did talk about that in April, but that committee was put together to look at a plan that goes out 20 years. With a mandate to look at all the facilities and possibly, if they felt it necessary, to call for 2009 bond election, which they did. They issued that report in April of 2009. These are some of the things they found. They looked at research. They looked at what they thought a Creighton school should be. So they looked at how big a classroom should be, what the front office should look like, what should be included in the school, all of that kind of stuff. And they then looked at all the systems in each of the schools and sort of ranked them in order. We used kind of a point system. So I came in about halfway through, so the data had been looked at that point, and they were in the process of actually looking at our school facilities and evaluating them for example, the electrical system, its suitability for new technology, and that kind of stuff, and assigning them points. And in the end, they recommended facilities for major renovation in rank order, and here is that rank order that they came up with. So So Papago School was right at the top, and that had been, has been addressed. And Mackin School had the second most points in the system that they used. So we called for that election, and that prevailed, and so we had authorization to issue $44 million in bonds. And this is what the pamphlet said, and the pamphlet language that you go to is the guiding rule that you have to follow when you spend those monies. So under the non-administrative purposes section, we had $39 million to renovate and construct school buildings. So 17 and some million was spent on Papago, and we have ongoing projects around the district. A variance from the pamphlet language of 10% is allowed, and that's sort of a recognition that any plan that you put into place begins its sort of path to obsolescence as soon as you issue it. For example, at the time we did that, well, since the time that we did that, security has become a higher priority. Also, we budget for 2 schools 4 years before now, and probably the cost has changed a little bit. So we'll see how that goes, but that's why they include that 10% waiver. We present every year in October exactly how we used the proceeds in the prior year. So I took that and brought it up to date through June 17th, and this is where we are with that program. We issued just over $22 million. There's a little bit of a premium in June of 2010. The renovate and construct, that's the cost of Papago there, about $17.5 million. And the other projects, fences, painting, the safety of parking lots. We did a couple parking lots based upon the Auditor General's finding that we had some unsafe loading zones. We took care of that, and there's other things going on still in the district. That cost $2.8 million. And we have cash on hand yet of 1.6, and we've entered into an agreement to do some work on the HVACs at Gateway School that we have purchase orders out for about $700,000, and that leaves $931,000 for the early part of this next year. That leaves $22 million in remaining authority. So the recommendation for tonight is to call for the issue of those $22 million in remaining bond authority. That would address Mackin School per the long-term facilities plan. It would also allow us to add some security projects that possibly weren't on the radar when we first did that, when we first called for that election, like some front office design and some security fencing, and also to continue building renewal projects such as our fairly obsolete intercom system. We have some doors that are not ADA compliant, and ongoing life cycle issues such as HVAC. That's the end of my prepared material. You all have questions?
If you don't have questions now, I can bring up our white card person who wants to speak to the board on this, and then we can, as you wish, we can discuss further if that works. So I will call up Mr. Joe Nolan. Please introduce yourself. You know the procedure. You have 5 minutes.
Joe Nolan, 3302 East Roma, patron of the district. Good for the school districts throughout the state, that new legislation. Great for the bond sellers, great for the bond attorneys. Everybody gets to make a little bit more money. My concern kind of comes back to what it's always been, and that's how thorough the whole bond committee deal was, and where the Creighton district is at today versus where it even was 2009, 2007. student population, things of that nature. It is my understanding, mostly Mackin, for most of you that probably know, Mackin, other than Excellencia and Gateway, is the newest school in the district. It was rebuilt in 1991 or 1990, yeah, 91. And then another $800,000-900,000 was spent on it in the bond of 96 and 97. When I asked the question is why did Mackin get chosen, the only answer I really got was the classrooms are too small. Then you hear rumors of they have rat infestation. Is there any truth to that they have a rat problem there? They do, okay. So I don't know, maybe they're tearing it down because they need to get rid of the rats and what have you, I don't know. But I would suggest, because you do have a fiduciary responsibility and all of this has changed a lot over the last 5 years, is really re-look at those schools. As I've said before, and Charlotte has, given me that information, that you're down a couple thousand students in the last 6, 7 years. Do you need 9 schools? Bolts has closed a school. Do Creighton and Bolts need to be separate individual elementary school districts? Does Wilson have to be a separate district with one school? And these are things that, you as a board should be taking, because remember, this bond was not, in this facilities program, was not an administrative-driven agenda item. It was driven by one board member. So to think that all of a sudden now they're omnipotent and they know everything that there is to know on it would be wrong. I'll just give you one example. The last big bond they had in '96 was there was some money left over, call it $1 million, and was presented to the board at that time, the members of the board, to build a brand new boardroom, and it could also be used as a classroom. And the board at that time said, we want other options. We don't think that that's the best use of that money. So Dr. Bogner and Cindy Earl, who was the special ed person at the time, came back with the Compass Center. Now the numbers on the Compass Center at that time led us to believe that it'd be a profitable deal and actually put money into the coffers. It didn't turn out that way. However, it still, in my opinion, was the right thing to do with that money. But that was only because that board did not rubber stamp what was given to them, but said, wait a second. I wasn't here, especially for the new board members. You weren't there when all this bond committee stuff was going on. You don't know exactly how they came in to their decisions on what to make. And the district's a lot different looking place than it was back then. And I think that if you don't at least look forward and say, hey, maybe we ought to take another look at this, then I think maybe you're not doing what you were elected to do. And one other thing, and I gotta say this, and I speak my mind too much. I said to Charlotte when I was at this at the meeting when the bonding people came here and said, hey, yeah, you're gonna have plenty, don't worry about it, you're gonna have that bonding capacity, it's gonna go up 2% a year. And Scott Walmer said, I still laugh when I think about it, said, geez, they weren't too bad, they said it was gonna go up 2% a year and it only went down 35%. And I said to Charlotte at that time, business is business. And I would not use that bond selling company again, because I did not think they gave you good advice through the whole process, and now you reward them for that. Just a personal opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nolan. So we have questions, discussion. You've seen a presentation. Anyone have questions, comments?
What? So we have on our August 3rd agenda the draft long-term facilities plans, one of the agenda items, which I'm assuming from that we're going to, it says review the plan, so clearly there's an opportunity to look at the plan. I know it's been presented a couple of times in terms of some of the details. I think the first time it was presented, the questions that I asked were kind of in the same vein as our public comment, in that, a lot is, there's been a long time since that plan was developed, and have there been other circumstances that would have either reprioritized any of the other schools based on either the circumstances of the school or the nature of the buildings themselves. If you look at the facilities plan document, there are some campuses even then that seemed like, quite honestly, they were in dire straits, and I can only imagine that they've gotten, at least stayed the same or gotten worse in the 5 years since that facilities assessment was done. So during our August, if we were to vote on the bonding capacity, are we committing ourselves to this existing facilities plan, or just the option of going out for the bonding capacity and then later to be identifying the schools and or facilities that we would be addressing?
Dr. Wagner or Dr. Boyle?
Well, I believe the motion is just to sell the bonds.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the specifics of that, I think the board still has leeway to review the plan and make adjustments as it sees fit.
So to reiterate the question, you brought up a question with me. So the bond we were talking about, I know we were having presentations about things that were falling short of for the students, computers and technology and things like that. Does the bond only cover buildings and structures like that, or could it cover computers and technology? I know it can't cover teacher salary and things like that, but
Our bonds cannot pay for equipment. That statute changed, but it was after us. And to address the question before that about the long-range plan, we're limited by the pamphlet language. So the amount that we showed that was for renovation or construction, school buildings, and the amount for renewal is we're limited to the $39 million for construction, the $5 million for project.
But we're not limited in terms of where that gets focused.
Exactly.
In other words, that could be, we did not specify in the pamphlet language what the schools were.
That's correct.
Okay.
Like schools and which order. So as long
That's
as we
correct.
comply with either the language or that 10% buffer,
Yes.
in the event that we decided to go that route. But certainly, so in terms of some of the direction for the work study then, I between now and then, obviously, we won't have an opportunity to have another advisory committee that's going to be able to go through and, update the plan that we currently have. But I am interested in knowing, in terms of the existing campuses, one, is it the recommendation to do a whole school? And if so, which school? Or is it, here are our priorities? Right now you're looking at each other. Or are there priority items in each school that really are critical that should be addressed? Because obviously if we were to rebuild an entire campus, that would take a significant amount of that $22 million, which would leave all of the rest of our campuses back in the dire straits. So I'm curious about what kind of information that you'll be able to get for that point.
I think that information already exists.
Okay.
And I do think there are needs across the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's something that the board would have to look at in terms of direction. We have issues where we have buildings were put in as modulars that we've made permanent.
Mm-hmm.
At many of the campuses, we made permanent by ripping out the wood floors and putting in concrete. Not the best quality buildings. They were temporary, but they've been in place for, I can't tell you how many years, but it's been longer than their life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So there are needs, and we've identified those. In fact, it did that originally because we did not know if the $22 million would be available, and what would be available would not be enough to address a single school.
Mm-hmm.
And so looking at what would those priority projects be. So I believe we have that information.
Thank you.
Questions? Dr. Boyle? did you-
On the publicity pamphlet, can you remind us of the language as far as, we know that a certain amount was to support needs of the other sides. What was the ballot language as far as reconstruction, renovation of sites?
You mean the,
In other words, did the ballot language say that we were looking at 2 schools?
No.
Okay.
So, not that I'm suggesting this, Mr. Walmer, but just as an option. So for example, this could be something where it could be renovation and or replacement of buildings could be, previously we've had campuses that have kind of the old military barracks style, and in the past when we've done bonds, we've put a shiny new office up front, so it's not to say it's putting lipstick on a pig, but from the street, a lot of our buildings that are 60 plus years old don't look 60 plus years old because they have offices that were built in the late 80s or early 90s. But that's something, I think there's a lot to be said for having the self-contained campus of redoing an entire campus like we did with Papago, especially in a day and age where we do have lockdowns and students can't circulate in those old buildings, which also were built before air conditioning and built when we started school in September. But we would have the ability to address, potentially if this were decided, would we not still renovating or replacing multiple buildings on multiple campuses, I guess is my question.
Yeah.
So if that were our prerogative, even if we sold the bond money, it could be replacing a few buildings in Mackin and a few of some other.
Renovate and construct is a pretty broad.
Renovate and or
Renovate and construct, and then improve and upgrade. We've got options.
So I guess one of my questions, I have a couple questions regarding Mackin, and again, it's not, I guess we do have the option of changing things, but with regard to Mackin and with regard to roof rats, and I realize that's not the only issue there, but how do you, I think it's a broader issue given the neighborhood that we live in, that roof rats are pretty pervasive throughout pretty much all of the Creighton district. And I know that we've had them in the building that I live in. So how do you build a building in a way, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Sukanik, that you don't have roof rats again? How do you, is it just something you, okay, may not be something that you can do?
They can climb walls. We think we know where they're coming from because for example, they've used flour to watch where they come from, see their footprints and all that stuff. And we build a wall, dig down deep, but they can still climb them. We don't know the answer to that question.
They go along power lines too, so.
So it could be something, I know, like with fire remediation in the high country of Arizona, one of the first things you do is you make sure that you have kind of that distance between your trees, and so they're not hanging over your roof, so if the trees catch fire, they're not falling on you. So I'm guessing that if we were to do something, we would want to make sure that it might be something like spacing from alleys.
Yeah, that's quite a unique area there because we have the irrigation valley just behind there, but we do have this spread of about 15 feet of asphalt. We've taken all the trees down. We've taken every precaution, worked with the professionals almost for 2 years now. And I'm happy to say we're down to almost nothing, but we still have to continually manage it. And it's what they call manage it because of course you cannot eliminate it. I've had colleagues of mine that had similar situations, tore down and built new buildings and stuff. You have to be very careful in the construction. You have to make sure you have door sweeps. You have to make sure all your openings are contained, vents on the doors and all that kind of stuff on the new construction. And of course, the sad thing is they still find a home in the new building. So
It's always management. You gotta make sure your shrubs are and trees and your wires, like you said, are away from the building. So it would have to be unique, whatever you decide to do, that we do the best we can.
And then I do have another question that's not not related to that. During the school construction process with Papago, because it was on two sides of the street, and I'm very grateful that we now have a building that's a campus that's on one side of the street, although we still own that property, but I don't think we have kids who have to, kindergartners who have to cross the street with a crossing guard in order to go to lunch at the library. We were able to keep some of our students on campus at Papago. I know that other schools, when they have been rebuilt, and I'm remembering just because I've driven by there so many times when Madison, I think #1 at 16th Street and Missouri was rebuilt. The school's here, the playground's here, and you basically build the new building on the playground while the kids are still there. My understanding is that with Mackin, is it not our smallest or one of our smallest campuses as far as the footprint?
Yes, it is.
The land, okay. So it seems to me that it would be unlikely that we would be able to keep any children on the campus at Mackin while we are doing construction if we were to do that. Is that correct? Or very few, most
Yeah,
would have.
maybe, maybe not. It depends on the design and what the design would be and how that design would be oriented on the property. But we think it's likely that you would have to relocate students.
And we do have Papago West as a location.
You're on about a 9-acre plot right there, which Papago was on just a little bit larger than a 9-acre plot. So you're almost looking similarity. And what you were talking with was they call it backward build. They build everything on the play fields at the time, and then when they get done with the building, they'll demolish it and start recreating the fields. But we're unique, as we have Papago as a mini school, I call it now, which we held up to 400 children there. And we had a feeding facility there, so it worked out really well for what we did to create there. So whatever we decide, like if you decide at Mackin to do the Bailey Wing, we can handle 400 of those children, and then probably like we did for Papago, we'll have a pocket of 3 or 4 here, 3 or 4 like we did for certain grade levels at other schools.
And, well, I know that the Auditor General has expressed their concerns about our enrollment as a percentage of what our buildings were quote-unquote designed to handle, which I believe is based on just a simple square footage formula and may not take into effect every single nook and cranny of how that space is used. But if we were to have Mackin under construction or any other school where we had to take those kids and move them to Papago West, it seems to me that the Auditor General has not taken into account the fact that we would essentially have a school closed during that construction period. So they would not be looking necessarily at our full, it may not be giving, my point is that it may not be giving us a true count of what our enrollment is as a percentage of capacity.
To be honest with that one, when we were having that debate in my office, I did that calculation myself, and it was 75% of capacity was their benchmark. And I calculated, I did that calculation with Papago School outside the equation, and I still came up just short of 75%.
Okay.
So that finding remained, and it still remains at their 2-year and final visit. It is still on.
Would the fact that we've increased in enrollment and a recalculation change much?
It wouldn't, not that much. I mean, if we closed down Mackin and filled the other facility up and add another 100 students this year, maybe, because it was close to 75% with one school offline. So it's possible in that scenario.
Mr. George, the other thing is that we built Papago for 100 students less. It's now at capacity, and we're using kind of some closets to do some of our extras in. We kind of wish we would have built it for the 100 students more. And so I don't know what that means other than Papago was dropping in enrollment, and when we reopened the school, it filled right back up, so.
I would certainly think that you have, it can be a difficult transition time as you're doing that, and you may lose students, and it may be hard when you lose students to get them back. And we've seen that with Biltmore Prep, where we knew we weren't going to go out there and, as we were rebuilding that school, not in a physical bricks and mortar sense, but rebuilding enrollment, we knew it wasn't going to start with 4th and 5th and 6th graders coming in from other schools. It was going to start with parents putting in kindergartners. So it sometimes takes a little bit of time, but it does seem like that's actually one of the selling points in a district where we have so many, where we may have kids who are opting, whose parents are opting to not send them to our schools, that facilities may be part of the reason, and that may actually attract and help increase our enrollment.
And in the rebuilding, you can resize.
Yeah.
Our schools, if you look at how they're laid out, you'll see that they're stretched out on the properties, right? You just go a little bit north to Kennedy, you see this property where the school has been stretched out along 28th Street and then run along the back with those modulars as it was growing. Don't, at all our campuses, we don't have the best, we haven't efficiently used that property in many cases. And so looking at that, it does give you an opportunity to take a look at what's the size, what's the current enrollment, what do we think the enrollment is going to be, and try to size that school appropriately. One, to address, obviously to address the Auditor General's requirements, but the other thing is to actually use that property in a much more efficient way.
Good points. I, just to express my personal opinion on this as a board member, I'm glad that we have the bond. I'm glad that the voters approved this in 2009. Without it, especially at a time of diminishing funds from the state to replace HVAC units and keep the temperatures in the room to the point where children can come in and learn, we would have had to pull that money out of M&O if we had not had the bond. And so I think it's been a tremendous improvement, and clearly you can look right now at Larry C. Kennedy where the parking lot's being redone. I know it was redone at Monte Vista. We have seen improvements at lots of different campuses as a result of this, and I'm quite comfortable with continuing with what the voters approved, knowing that we do have that caveat. We're not tonight saying that it has to go to a certain school, although we have a plan that was put in place, I think, with quite a bit of a year and a half of study and deliberation, and I was able to attend one of those meetings as it just terminated just as the time I was getting on the board. So I have faith and confidence in that plan, other than the fact that, as Ms. Glasgow-Kerr said, it may be, at this point, maybe a little outdated, but we need to, knowing that we can look at that again, I'm fully supportive of this. And I do know, looking from memory, some of those buildings at Mackin may be newer, but some of them date to 1954. They do have very small class sizes and may not be conducive to some of the types of learning that we have today.
So I'm also thankful for the fact that we have the opportunity to, create spaces for learning that eventually will bring that learning up to the 21st century in terms of the needs of the facilities. Having said that, and I think I mentioned this when we first started talking about long-range facilities, is that I'm excited about the opportunity on the 3rd to talk about this in a comprehensive way, to be able to look at the updated data, to be able to look at capacity versus enrollment, and to understand what right sizing looks like for our facilities, and if at that point it looks like we need to have conversations about too many buildings, that's the chance for us to have it with all of the data available. I appreciate the work that committees do. Committees work really, really hard. The committee that works, 5 years ago to create the current plan that we have, did that over an extended period of time, but there's a lot that's happened in 5 years, and so we absolutely want to make sure that our responsibility to our community is that these dollars will be used in the most effective and efficient manner possible to impact as many students as we can. That's my personal perspective in terms of the dollars and the way that I'd like to see those designated to our schools. So I'm looking forward to the conversation in terms of having that chance to really look at, dig a little bit deeper in terms of the information that staff will bring with us, will bring to us on the 3rd.
Other thoughts, comments, questions? This is listed as an action item, so we can take action tonight to approve the sale of school improvement bonds up to $22 million.
I move the governing board approve the sale of the school improvement bonds in the amount of $22 million.
Second.
It has been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? It is approved. We move on to item 6, which is approval of consent agenda. Do I have a motion?
I move the governing board approve consent agenda items A through Q in accordance with policy BEDB-R.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
It is approved. Give me a gavel, I'm going to hang that. We move on.